Hi, this is Chuck, and I'm going to talk about the four fields illustration. Basically, what this illustration is for, it's our basic strategy for developing disciple-making groups or churches. It's also a diagnostic tool to tell us how we're doing, and I'll explain that later in another video. And then we use this as a basic building block for generational mapping. And again, that's for a later video. So let's just use this illustration as a basic strategy, and we'll walk through it. The first thing we have is the entry strategy, and then we move on to the evangelistic side of this, gospeling, telling the gospel or sharing the gospel. Then we move on to discipleship, and then we go into group or family or church formation. And then ultimately what we're trying to do is train laborers and trainers for the next generation. So that's the basic strategy, the entry strategy, the gospeling, the discipleship, church formation, and then training laborers. Let's talk about each one individually. Entry strategy. Jesus basically had three entry strategies where he would move into a culture or context and use these strategies in order to engage the lost people. He would use the house of peace strategy that we see in Matthew 10 and Luke 10. He also used a synagogue tactic where he called out those who were hungry to grow from religious people who were attending the synagogue or the temple. Paul practiced the same tactic. And then the missional community where they're serving the community around them. Jesus did this through the feeding of the 5,000, the 4,000, casting out demons and healing the sick. So that's an entry strategy. One of the things I do is sit in Starbucks and pray for people, just engaging the lost. Then we move from the entry strategy into the gospeling strategy, or the part that's where we're doing evangelism. And we tell stories from the gospel. That's part of our way that we express the gospel. We're telling our testimonies, my story, and then Jesus' story, the gospel in a nutshell. And we use a two kingdoms illustration to do that. So that's the gospeling part of the strategy. Well, then we move into discipleship, and this is where our accountability groups come in, but we also recognize that people are being discipled right there in our groups and our churches. They're learning about Christ, and they're learning how to become like Him and help others do the same. But these accountability groups are really an essential part of this strategy. There are 2 to 4 people. They're gender specific, men's groups, women's groups. They use higher accountability questions, going deeper, and of course they're focused on training the next generation of disciple makers. So that's the disciple making or discipleship part of the four fields. And then we move on to church formation, group formation. Basically, we're trying to form a family. And so we want them to self-identify as a family or church. We help them grow towards maturity as a family, loving one another, encouraging one another, challenging one another. This means eating together and having fun together, celebrating together. But as a church, we're also going to practice the ordinances, communion, baptism, and giving. But ultimately, like every family, we reproduce individuals and families. So that's a sign of a mature church or group. And then we move on to the center field, which is laborers and trainers. And ultimately what we're trying to do, this is where trainers who can reproduce not only the process, but disciples. The process being the Bible study format that we're using. And then they're reproducing trainers that leads to reproducing groups and churches. And ultimately, this leads to generations of laborers living and discipling among the lost. So that is the 4 fields, and what we're doing is we're using this as a kind of a visual strategy for what we're doing. And we're very intentional about this, and in order to use this, you kind of go in a clockwise manner and then it repeats itself. Entry strategy, gospeling, discipleship, laborers and training, and then going back to the entry strategy and repeating the process. Okay, we'll be using this illustration in the future. I hope this is helpful. Please ask your questions on Facebook and keep making disciples.